because they've somehow figured out how to cook in drama, character, and a visceral feeling in a car that otherwise is all tech. I don't understand Porsche in that sense. What is up, guys? This is Rio, and today I'm sitting behind the wheel of a 2021 Porsche 911 Carrera S, a 992 C2S. And I'm going to explain to you guys why I believe that this is the perfect brand new 911, barring, of course, the new unreleased GT3. So I just reviewed a 2019 base Carrera 991.2 generation, the previous generation vehicle. I'll link that up above if you want to check it out, because I definitely will be alluding back to that video and that car, because I found that car to be the kind of nice, pure version of a 911, the purity spec, if you will. Closer to around 100 grand, giving you everything you want in a relatively new car. And I still believe that to be true. But I also believe, moving into the 992 generation, that if you kind of want the perfect all-around package, you jump into the S, you throw a few options, and relatively speaking, for a lot less money than a Turbo S, you get as much practical fun, because these things are ridiculously fast, even as is. With a tune, they can blow almost any car out of the water, and I believe having that rear-wheel drive gives you that slight advantage in the sense of fun factor. You get a little bit more drama out of the car, and you get a little bit more of a nimble and sharper bite up front. We'll get into that a bit more when we get the car driving, which I'm excited to do. But before I do that, I want to get a couple basic details out of the way. So, starting off, the 2021 Carrera S starts life at $115,100. With the options this car has, some of which I'll quickly run through, you're looking at about $139,000 sticker price on this particular car. This car has a chalk exterior, which is my personal favorite color on this car. That runs you about $3,500. It has a sport pack at $5,500 that gives you a sports chrono package up here, which gives you launch control in sports plus mode, and it also gives you a sports exhaust, which of course this car has. Sounds not great, but definitely better than the base system, and it gives you PASM, but that is either put on its own when you go into Sport Plus, or you can toggle it on with this switch over here on the center console. So you have a few options there. You also have sunroof, leather. This actually has a slightly upgraded Sport Seat Plus, so there are definitely some other options in this car, but relatively speaking, some of the basic ones are that Sport Pack and the chalk exterior color. Again, you can go so crazy with options on 911s. You can probably spec up a Carrera S from 115 all the way up to 165, 170 grand. I think it's a little bit crazy to do that. I think at that point, you're either better off almost pushing towards a turbo, waiting for maybe the new forthcoming GTS trim, or looking at used GT3s, cars like that. But at about $135,000, $145,000 bucks, I think that's the sweet spot of the Carrera S. And I actually think it's smarter that if you're gonna option out a 911, to start with a foundation of a Carrera S instead of a base Carrera. Even though not getting any options, I would just go with a base Carrera and go with a purity spec, the most budget friendly, although these cars aren't really that budget friendly at all. Furthermore, this car has a twin turbo 3-liter flat six producing 443 horsepower and 390 pound-feet of torque. That is a good chunk of horsepower more than the base car. It's somewhere around 60 horsepower over the base car. And you notice that with a car that weighs only around 3,400 pounds. So when you factor all that in, this is an exceptionally fun and balanced sports car. Obviously, it's rear biased in the sense of weight, because it has the motor all the way in the back, almost past the rear axle, although in the 992 generation, they have tried to bring it forward a little bit as compared to the 991s. As for wheels and tires, you get 20s up front, 21s in the back, so staggered setup in the sense of diameter. You also have 245s up front and 305s in the back, so definitely a nice chunky tire. Aesthetic-wise, it looks great, but more importantly, it gives you a good bit of rubber for good handling and grip. And for brakes, you get upgraded 6-piston calipers up front over the 4 pistons found in the base Carrera, and you get 4 pistons in the rear. Okay, so now I want to talk about the very last thing before I get this car on the road, which is that this car has an 8-speed PDK. Now it's 8-speed versus 7, which is really cool. However, compared to that aforementioned 991.2 that I reviewed several weeks ago, they have really changed the interior here on the new 992s. And I'll get into more detail as we get driving, but the one thing that I have to mention now is there is this bronze shaver here as the shifter, as the gear shifter. And I'm sure if you guys are into the car sphere, you've seen this before, but I gotta be honest, it's definitely not my favorite. And it's not the aesthetic, and it's not the size per se. It's the fact that now on these regular 911s, you're no longer able to use the gear shifter as a point of manual shifting, meaning you only have the paddle shifters. I believe on the new GT3, they're saying they're going to supposedly have some sort of shifter that you can use to shift with, even in the PDK cars, but it's a little thing, but I don't love that. And it is really small, I gotta be honest, but it also is, it's nice that Porsche has at least incorporated that Braun design into all the switches, and the AC controls, and even the starter over here on the left all have it. So at least they've incorporated the design, but not my favorite. Now, we're gonna do a record-breaking tall boy test. So check it out, and then we're gonna be out on the road driving this Porsche 911 Carrera S. So here's the tall boy test. I know you guys are thinking, no way, only one tall boy? Look, this car isn't for partying, this car is for driving, and driving it is what we're gonna do right now. So, setting off in the Carrera S. Wow, I mean, this is one heck of a car. I have it currently in Sport Plus. I have the PASM on because it naturally comes on with Sport Plus. The sports exhaust is on, the spoiler is up right now. I have this car in its highest settings, so we're gonna get the full taste of what a 911 is all about. Now, one of the first things that I notice is that Porsche just knows somehow still how to make the absolute best electric steering racks. Like, I can't believe this is electric steering. Now, I'm sure if I got right out of a hydraulic steering setup, I'd maybe be a little bit less bullish, but I have a BMW 340i, and that steering system is an embarrassment compared to this car. I mean, you would expect that at the price and with the brand Porsche, you know, with Porsche badges on your car, you'd expect great steering, nothing less, but it's just, they deliver so well on that promise and that expectation. Furthermore, the transmission is as snappy and sharp as always, especially again in Sport Plus. If I were to get on it right now, I mean, it just snaps through gears. Something I noticed is compared to the 991.2 cars, the very first cars that got turbos, you now have a bit less of a burble tune on the exhaust. I used to love burble tunes, but I tend to agree with the vast majority of the enthusiast community that they were getting a little long in tooth, and it's nice that some brands have toned that down a bit. It makes these cars a bit less antisocial. I think people, when they hear burbles, my car burbles for instance, when people hear it burbling, even when I'm driving by fairly slowly, they tend to automatically assume you're a douchebag, that you're speeding. And I think this car is, you know, so classic that it's nice that the noise doesn't have this artificial burble noise or sound. What I still have to mention though is that this car does not have a great sound. It's just the truth. I mean, it does have the sports exhaust, so it does give it a bit more of a high-pitched sound, but it's just unfortunate that the noise has come down so much on these base 911s ever since they've moved to turbochargers. It's one of the little things Porsche doesn't absolutely kill, and I think there's such a stark contrast between those naturally aspirated GT cars and essentially now the entire rest of the lineup. Yeah, I mean, I have no words for how this car makes you feel, because they've somehow figured out how to cook in drama, character, and a visceral feeling in a car that otherwise is all tech. I don't understand Porsche in that sense, but I want to get into some of the design elements of this car before I forget. So all 911s have looked relatively the same for the last 60 years, but it's important to note that this car is a bit of a departure from that more familiar 997, even 991 style, meaning they've gone a really far direction towards an angular, slightly sharper car, less curvy. The front, they've brought in some interesting design elements where the hood is now, the frunk, I should call it, is now a little bit sharper, the lines on it. The rear is a lot more angular. The taillights are very three-dimensional, which I actually personally like, but again, it takes a little getting used to. They've changed the rear grille, where it has a bunch of vertical lines now, and even the third brake light in the rear is vertical. So some little things that people may tend to not love at first, but I've grown to love the styling of this car. From the front is aggressive. These things look absolutely killer. And the sports exhaust looks very cool with the ovals that actually look almost the exact same as the Turbo S in the rear. So you really can get a very, very sporty and sharp look while simultaneously being just subdued enough and just classic enough to never feel like you're standing out too much from the crowd. I think that's a perfect balance that Porsche is always able to strike, that other brands and other makes that make a little bit more of, let's say, exotic cars are never able to meet. Now, as for the interior, they've also changed a ton. The one thing I can say is they've brought the interior quality up a bit. They have brought a lot more leather and luxury into this car in a way that feels a bit more premium. One of the biggest changes they made, though, is the entire dash is very different. You get a much wider and larger touchscreen that works exceptionally well. I used to be very anti-touchscreens, and I quite liked cars that had controllers where you didn't have to move your hand around and look at the screen to do things. But I will admit that Porsche has made their system so simple and their screen works so well, it's so responsive that I am more than okay with it. Also, I have very little reason to interact with it. You know, a lot of what I want to do can either be done on these steering wheel hotkeys or via maybe just quick action with your phone or voice. So you don't need to interact with the system way too much. What I will say, though, is they have dramatically changed the gauge cluster. It's much more similar now to the Porsche Taycan system. You still have your 5 gauges, but 4 of them, 2 outer on each side, are now digital. They're screens, but the center is still a analog tack with a small digital speed and your gear readout essentially next to it. I've noticed, not only based on how they have it laid out, but just based on my personal take on this car, I'm really only focusing on that center tack and that center gauge, and focusing on the tack and the speed. So, you know, my engine speed and my actual speed are the only things that really matter. So as I'm paying attention mostly to just the tachometer, one thing I do notice is that this car has a very nice and meaty power band. This is something that's more noticeable to me here on this Carrera S than it was on that base 991.2 I drove a few weeks back. The car has a ton of power and a ton of torque, almost 400 pound-feet of torque, which I know in this new world of T63s and all these cars having 500 pound-feet of torque doesn't seem like a lot, but this car really weighs about almost 800 pounds less than those cars and really gives you a sense of a ton of power. I mean, I can't even speak when I'm driving this, it's so fast. So the only little thing that I noticed that I don't love is peak torque is at 2,500 RPM and peak power is at 6,500 RPM. So you get that nice 4,000 RPM of that meaty power band I'm talking about, but you have a red line at 7,500. And while I like having that slightly higher red line and being able to rev the car out a bit more, I do notice the power and definitely the torque tapering off a lot at that higher range. So if you're holding the gears around 5,000 or 6,000, you're not gonna get that naturally aspirated feeling that some people are used to, especially if they skipped over the 991.2 generation or coming straight from a 991 or older car into this. So you have to kind of adjust. I'm accustomed to it enough that I don't really find myself holding the car ever around 4 or 5 and expecting to play around in that top 3,000 RPM. But it is something to know. And this car definitely has now become more daily drivable by, let's say, being faster and sportier in that lower rev range, in that more daily drivable rev range. Jesus Christ. Yeah, I mean, this car makes you, it puts a smile on your face. I can't say more than that. This car puts a smile on your face. Really a big fan of the philosophy Porsche seems to subscribe to, which is lighter cars, balanced, nimble, edging on oversteer, and giving you a car that in every way feels like it's tuned for the driver. I know that that can be considered impractical, like this car doesn't have realistic rear seats. You really only have the frunk. I'm not saying that it is practical, because it's not, but it's more practical than a Ferrari. It's more affordable than a Ferrari, but unfortunately still, the thing that takes away from this car in my mind is that they really have come up a lot in price. And when you're looking at these cars for near $150,000, they're really not accessible to most people, to most enthusiasts. And I think that's the biggest attractor to this car, because otherwise, the way it's been engineered, the way it's been built, it doesn't get much better than this, at least not for a contemporary vehicle. And the fact that you have this nimble, accurate steering, you have this incredibly powerful vehicle that, I mean, I can't even put into words how that feels, but it really is unfortunately a little bit inaccessible at the price point, but more accessible than a Turbo S. I'm gonna end it on that. It's more accessible than a Turbo S. So I think somebody looking to spend definitely a good chunk of change, but looking to spend a more reasonable amount of money than the Audi R8s and Turbo S's of the world, who doesn't necessarily need the naturally aspirated, more visceral feeling of the yet to be released GT3, you go with this car. This is the daily driver. This is the car that with a tune will smoke most people just about on any road, provided you, the driver, are capable of it, because this is a real sports car. And I think for that, the Carrera S is kind of the best foundation for your run-of-the-mill, optioned up, decently priced Porsche 911. And I think anybody getting into one of these would be, you'd have to be crazy to be disappointed by this car. This is an absolute monster vibe. Until I drive a Turbo S, this is a monster vibe. This is a ridiculously fast, ridiculously performance-oriented, balanced vehicle. It gives you tech, it gives you daily drivability, it gives you a visceral feeling somehow along with those two other things, and it makes you feel like you're driving one of the best damn brand new cars that money can buy. I really appreciate everyone for watching this video. Make sure to tune back in for more. Like, comment, subscribe. This is Rio. Peace.